Okay, hello, good morning everyone. Good morning. Okay, for today, we will start discussing another chapter of topic for semifinals. Specifically, we will talk about Autacoids. Okay, so yung main goal ko today is to finish the first specific type of Autacoids up until the adverse effects of histamine. So I hope everyone will bear with me. Please focus on the discussion, ha? Okay, so let me start. In our prior discussion in the introduction of pharmacology, I have mentioned already this term Autacoids, if you can still remember. Recall that Autacoids, this is considered an endogenous compound. So take note, this is considered an endogenous compound. Diba? This is an endogenous ligand. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, endogenous compound inside our body, we naturally synthesized this compound. Okay? And just like any other endogenous compound, this play a very important role in the physiological processes in our body. And aside from physiological processes, ang one of the characteristics ng mga Autacoids, they also contributes to the pathological processes in the body. Ibig sabihin, they contribute to association of certain diseases. Say for example, pag too much or excess yung level or concentration ng histamine, for instance, which is an Autacoid in our body, that leads to certain allergic reactions. So that is part of pathological processes. Now, let me define first Autacoid based on the origin of the term itself. Okay? So, ako siyang hation ang Autacoids into two originated words. So, yung term nga Autacoids, they originally comes from the Greek word, take note, autos. Ibig sabihin, di ba, pag autos is self. Auto, di ba, self. Recall katong pag discuss na ako about auto regulation, ibig sabihin ng auto regulation, yung auto ibig sabihin self. Okay? Then the other Greek word is yung akos. Akos ibig sabihin relief or remedy or healing. Okay? So meaning the term as a whole, ang Autacoids na term, it suggests that yung mga molecules na to are said to be self-healing. Okay, self-healing na mga molecules. And take note, Autacoids, they are said to have a local action. Take note, Autacoids, once released by certain cells in our body, they exhibit local action. Okay? Local action. Specifically, yung site of action niya, site of action, is within the site of release of Autacoid. Okay? Nasabtan ba? Kung asa na release, asa na secrete ang specific Autacoid na yan by a certain cell, didto ra pod ang iyahang site of action or naara dira near ang site of action. So ibig sabihin hindi systemic yung effect once ma-release ang specific type of Autacoid. Local lang yung effect niya. Okay? That is why Autacoids are also referred to as local hormones. Okay? Local hormones with a very short half-life. Okay? Very short half-life. So take note, same lang yan. Autacoids, local hormones. Autacoids, local hormones. And what are the specific examples of local hormones? Diba? We have histamine, serotonin, eicosanoids, and bradykinin. I have mentioned this already. Tandaan nyo lang yung mnemonics na BESH. Diba? BESH. Okay? So this will be the flow of our discussion on Autacoids. We will start with histamine. Okay, we will start with histamine. So I hope today we can at least finish the lecture on histamine. Then the remaining subtopics, serotonin and eicosanoids, this will be discussed in the following meeting. For bradykinin, this is not actually part of pharmacology 1. Okay, this will be discussed in higher pharmacology. So under ni siya sa pharmacology 2, specifically under cardiovascular drugs. So just to give you an idea about bradykinin, si bradykinin, this is a very powerful endogenous vasodilator. Okay, very powerful endogenous vasodilator. So yan yung um, cellular effect niya kapag available siya, freely available yung bradykinin in the body. Vasodilation yung action niya. So it targets the blood vessels. Vasodilation. Okay? So again, for Autacoids, we will only discuss histamine, serotonin, and eicosanoid. And for today, I will only discuss histamine. Okay? Now, before I start the discussion with histamine, let me emphasize first the differences no, between local hormones and a hormone. Magkaiba po yung local hormone sa alam nyo na hormones. Okay? So please take note that local hormones, so yung first column is all about local hormones, yung mga autacoids. Please take note, local hormones, they differ. They differ from hormones because of the following. Number 1, ang mga local hormones, they are not produced by a specific gland. Okay, they are not produced by a specific gland. Instead, kapag sinabing local hormone, they are being produced virtually by many cells. Virtually by many cells or all cells. Okay? So yan yung unang difference ng local hormone sa hormones. So ibig sabihin kapag hormones, specific gland lang ang nagpo-produce ng isang hormone. Okay? So take note kapag hormone, it is produced only by a specific gland. Okay? So let's say for example, yung very simple example, yung insulin. Diba? We all know, I believe you are all familiar with this hormone. Diba? Hormone yung insulin. And insulin that is being secreted by the beta cells of the pancreatic gland. Okay, na-mention ko siya sa mga prior discussion. Okay, and take note, that is the only gland in our body, yung pancreatic gland lang po in our body that is able to secrete insulin. Wala na ilain gland. Okay, so for insulin, specific gland lang yun ang produce of insulin, and that is only the beta cells of pancreatic glands. Whereas, for local hormones, example, histamine, serotonin, eicosanoids, they have different sites of release. So later, you will learn the different location of histamine release, serotonin release, etc. Okay? So again, this is the number 1 difference of local hormone from a hormone. Okay, local hormone, they are not produced by a specific gland. Instead, they are produced virtually by many cells. Okay, number 2, autacoids differ from hormones because they are not being transported via circulation, unlike mga hormones. Diba? I-recall nato, diba? Local hormones. Ibig sabihin, they only produces local action, local effect. Okay? Thus, they can never be transported by blood circulation to produce a systemic effect in the body. Kasi nga, local lang naman yung effect niya. So, kung saan siya na-release na specific cell in the body, dun lang din yung action niya. Di na kailangan nga i-circulate pa siya sa blood, okay, para systemic yung effect niya. Because that will not be a local hormone already. Kasi systemic na yung action, that is already a hormone na. Okay, so as the term suggests, local lang ang effect. Okay, local lang ang effect ng mga local hormones. Whereas, hormones, kapag hormones naman, hormones, they provide systemic effect. Okay, systemic effect. Again, very good example ulit, insulin. Diba? Although si insulin, it is produced only by a specific gland, isa lang ka gland ang ga-secrete og insulin, but if you try to imagine, diba, the effect in the body ng insulin is very systemic, diba? It is able to lower blood glucose level, blood sugar level. So systemic yung effect ng insulin. Kahit isang specific gland lang yung nagpo-produce ng insulin. Okay, so overall, these are the main points why local hormones differ from hormones. Okay, so again, local hormones is produced only, produced virtually by many cells, and it has a local action. So baliktarin nyo lang, those are for hormones naman. Okay, so at this juncture, let us begin our discussion on histamine. So this will be our topic outline in the discussion on histamine. So we will talk about the major distribution of histamine, saan widely distributed ang histamine, asa siya majorly gaka-release. Okay, what cells that releases or produces histamine. Then we will also discuss the synthesis, the steps in the synthesis of histamine, including the degradation pathways of histamine, the different receptor subtypes of histamine, kung asa ga-bind ng mga receptor ang histamine, including the specific responses ng mga ng mismong organ kapag na-stimulate yung histamine receptor na present doon. Then we will also discuss the drugs, its clinical application of the drugs, and the most important adverse effects ng mga stated drugs in the presentation. Okay, so let's start with the location of histamine. Okay, so generally, ang histamine as an autacoid, it is present in high concentrations in our skin. Okay, present siya in higher concentration in our skin and also in the mucous layer of the lungs, including in the GI tract. Now, on a cellular level, histamine is widely distributed. It is largely found on the following cells. We have the MAST cells, okay, and the basophils. Again, ang histamine, this is largely produced, largely found in the following cells. We have mast cells, basophils. Yung basophil, this is a type of white blood cell. Okay, this is a type of white blood cell. Also, there are significant concentrations, significant number of histamine being produced by the ECL cells. ECL cells, that stands for enterochromaffin. Like cells. Again, ECL, that stands for enterochromaffin-like cells. Okay, so yung ECL cells, these are located in the fundus part of the stomach. So sa stomach na siya. Tatandaan nyo lang basta ECL cells, okay, sa stomach na siya makita, located. In fact, yung histamine na nare-release, okay, yung mga histamine na nare-release by the ECL cells, yun yung primary trigger para ma-secrete yung gastric acid sa stomach. Okay? Again, yung histamine na nare-release ng ECL cells by the in the stomach, those are the triggers, main trigger, primary trigger that is able to secrete the gastric acid in the stomach. Okay? So kung mataas yung histamine level being secreted in the stomach, taas din yung HCl, yung gastric acid in the stomach. Okay, and finally, we also have cells that is able to produce histamine in the CNS. Okay, wherein histamine in CNS, histamine in CNS in the brain particularly, they occur as neurotransmitter. Okay, they occur as neurotransmitter. Kaya nakasulat dito histaminergic neuron. Okay, histaminergic neuron. Okay, and how does histamine being produced in the CNS? It is being released upon activation of the following central receptors, central nervous system receptors. We have N-methyl D-aspartate, the mu opioid receptors, dopamine receptors. All these receptors are located in the CNS. Okay, so once being activated, they are able to release histamine in the CNS. Kaya, part din yung CNS histaminergic neuron as cells which produce major amounts of histamine. Okay. Now, let me give you an idea how histamine is being produced, being released from a mast cell or from a basophil. Diba? It is stated here sa diba, activation signal kaning nasa left side. Ito yung mga triggers. Triggers na sila paano nare-release or bakit nare-release yung histamine from these cells. Okay, so it is stated here sa mast cells, sa basophils, na one of the triggers has something to do with immunoglobulin E. IgE or immunoglobulin E cross-linking, including allergy-inducing drugs. Okay, so kung naay daw mga allergy-inducing drugs or immunoglobulin complementing, that activates mast cells, releasing histamine. So for instance, again ha, yung i-discuss ko dito, paano nare-release yung histamine, paano nare-release yung histamine from a mast cell due to some allergic reaction. So for instance, itong bilog, kani siya, this is the mast cell. Okay, so this is the mast cell. So yung nakikita nyo, merong receptor. Di ba na ay receptor kaning kaning color green. Okay, kani siya. This is a receptor kung saan naka-attach yung immunoglobulin E. Immunoglobulin E, yan yung letter Y ba? Dili na siya letter Y, good ha? Iharang kuan ba, shape mo siya, letter Y. Nga naman ang usual nga orientation kung i-illustrate ang isang immunoglobulin. Okay? So again, sa isang mast cell, you can observe here an immunoglobulin receptor, or this is also known as Fc epsilon Ri receptor. This is a receptor, no? Kung saan naka-attach yung immunoglobulin E. Okay? Now, in a mast cell, this one. Okay? Kaning bilog sa mast cell, yung mga kulay black, okay, those are histamines. Okay? Imagine those are histamine that are being sequestered being bounded into granules. Okay, so imagine inside a mast cell, you have a histamine being sequestered. Okay, they are being sequestered, they are being bounded in granules or in a vessel. Okay, now for histamine to be released, from a mast cell, kailangan ng trigger, kailangan ng activation signal. Okay? Now, ang pinaka-common na trigger to activate mast cells are allergens. Okay? So example, allergy. Okay, allergens. Di ba pag sinabing allergens, that could be any substances that could cause allergic reactions. And daghan man ta klase allergens that could have allergic reaction, di ba? Natay mga tao nga allergic sa certain food, na ubang tao allergic sa certain drugs, certain scent, certain insects, certain flowers, etc. So daghan ta klase nga mga allergens. Now let me extract one specific example of a drug inducing allergy. So example ang ato ang ihatag dito rin nga example is a drug inducing allergy. Okay? And again ha, kapag may allergen, that could trigger mast cell activation. Okay? So example of a drug, let's say tubucurarin. Okay? A tubucurarin. By the way, ang inyuhang hint when to tell if a certain drug causes allergic reaction or hypersensitivity reaction is that dapat yung drug na yan is coming from or derived from a plant source. Okay, mo na siya ang usual hint. Usually good, basta ang drug derived from a plant source, kaakibat nila is a hypersensitivity reaction, allergic reaction. Kasi usually yung mga plant, naagi na sila gina-carry nga certain allergens. Okay? So tubucurarin, I think you're all familiar sa gamot na to. Diba? This is a naturally occurring alkaloid. Ang tubucurarin, isang Coureur. Okay, Coureur alkaloid. Sige, before ko magpadayon, let me ask you, tubucurarin, is it a sympathetic or parasympathetic drug? You may type in your answer. Is it a sympathetic or parasympathetic drug? Actually, nani siya sa ANS drugs. Wala, pass. Yes, this is a parasympathetic drug. Very good. Okay, isa siyang parasympathetic drug. Sige, one last question. Kung parasympathetic drug siya, is it an agonist or antagonist? Is it a cholinergic agonist or antagonist? Agonist, antagonist. Okay, very good. Di ba na siya sa last part sa inyong handouts? Murag last phrase sa inyong handouts sa parasympathetic drug na dito na mention ang side effect ng tubucurarin. Okay? So, yung tubucurarin again, this is a drug. Isa siyang drug, isang cholinergic antagonist. Particularly, isa siyang skeletal muscle relaxant, diba? Skeletal muscle relaxant siya nga drug that induces, isa sa yung common side effect, especially at high doses, tubucurarin causes allergic side effect. Okay? And because of this allergic side effect, nai-increase, okay, na-enhance niya yung histamine release from mast cell. And that is also stated sa inyong handout sa parasympathetic drugs. Try to check, scan gali ninyo inyong notes on parasympathetic drugs. Ang tubucurarin, isa sa yung side effect is anaphylaxis because of increased histamine secretion or histamine release. Increase yung histamine release. Kasi again nga, tubucurarine is a drug inducing allergy. Okay? Now, how do mast cells release histamine in this case? Now, so say for instance, we have this drug allergen, a drug antigen that will actively bind. It will actively bind to, ayan, kaning color yellow. Di ba? Muna siya ang antigen. It will actively bind to the serum IgE. Okay, it will actively bind to immunoglobulin E. And asa naka-attach ang immunoglobulin E? Naka-attach siya sa receptor niya. Okay? The immunoglobulin E receptor, or another name sa immunoglobulin E receptor is Fc epsilon. This is an epsilon sign, kaning murag letter E ba? Epsilon sign Ri receptor. Okay, now, attachment or binding of these antigens, allergens to immunoglobulin E, that will automatically activate mast cells, that will stimulate mast cells. And of course, ang net result kapag na-stimulate yung mast cell, release diretso ng histamine from intracellular granules. So, what will happen, di ba? Mga granules man na sila inside the cell. Kapag na-active inside the cell, sa mast cell, kapag na-activate yung mast cell, that will lead to degranulation. Okay? Mag-degranulate. There will be removal, no, of those molecules that are in granules. Okay? So, yun yung mga histamines. Okay? Magre-release yung mga histamines. And other na mga related mediators ng allergic inflammatory reactions. Okay? Kasi if you try to read more about mast cells, hindi lang naman histamine yung kino-contain niya. Okay? There are other mediators ng allergic inflammatory reactions that may also be released kapag na-activate, na-stimulate yung mast cells. So since yung focus ng topic natin is histamine, I just emphasized here histamine. Okay? So again, kapag na-release yung histamine from a mast cell, that will ultimately lead to allergic reactions. And diba, daghan ta signs and symptoms kapag may allergy, na ay itching, na ay swelling, na ay pain, redness of the skin, there is difficulty in breathing, and many more. Okay, depende na siya. Okay. Now, question. Question, if histamine release causes allergic reaction, what drugs do you think will offer clinical benefit to patient? Is it a histamine agonist or a histamine antagonist? What do you think does the patient needs kapag may allergic reaction siya due to histamine? Very good. Kailangan niya ng histamine antagonist. Okay? Kaya nga 'di ba, yung usual available sa market sa mga over-the-counter drugs, mga OTC drugs are antihistamines. 'Di ba? Antihistamines man usually kapag drugs related to this Autacoid histamine. Wala kayo tayong mga histamine agonist available in the market. Kasi nga, usually, kapag available ang histamine, mataas yung level ng histamine in the body, it causes pathological processes. So, mura siya negative somehow ang iyahang effect if excessive or too much level na yung histamine in the body. Kaya, later on, yung madadiscuss natin ng mga drugs, focus more sa mga antihistamines. Okay? Wala kayo i-tackle. Okay? Naigamay katong synthetic nga histamine, but again, that is not available in the market. Okay? Yung synthetic na histamine. Okay? So, yan din yung reason bakit sa notes nyo, di ba, sa handouts nyo on tubucurarine, kung inyo i-scan inyong previous notes about tubucurarine, ang best treatment for the anaphylaxis or anaphylactic reaction caused by tubucurarine is Sige, ito ang best treatment kapag, yes, very good, epinephrine. Okay, best treatment, ayan, dali lang na ako ibutang. Treatment caused by anaphylaxis manifested due to tuberculin is epinephrine. Okay, epinephrine. Okay, and 'di ba sa adrenergic drugs, you have learned that epinephrine is the first line treatment in the management of anaphylaxis. Mo gina inyo hang permidumduman. Epinephrine gid kung ano grabe na gyud nga anaphylactic attack, first line gid always nga treatment. Okay? For anaphylaxis, anaphylactic shock, anaphylactic attack, anaphylaxis reaction, kada major na gyud nga anaphylaxis is epinephrine. Okay? Now, aside from tuberculin, there are many other drugs nga ga-induce og histamine release. So I'll give you few examples. So other example, I take note nyo na lang. Other examples aside from tuberculin that induces histamine release are the following. We have atropine, di ba? Atropine is also a drug derived from plant sources. That is why pwede siya magka-hypersensitivity reaction. Reserpine. Reserpine is also an alkaloid. So derived yapon siya sa plant. Morphine as well is a natural drug, di ba? Naturally derived nga drug, morphine. So sa plant na sila na derived. Plant yung sources nila. Okay. So that is how mast cell is being activated by certain allergen, particularly by a drug inducing allergy. Okay? And ultimately, kapag na-activate yung mast cell, it will release histamine. Okay? So, again, akong i-recall, we have 4 major locations or cells where histamine are largely produced. We have mast cells and basophils. We have the ACL cells located in the stomach. Then we have CNS or in the brain. These are the major histamine-producing cells. And there are actually other cells in the body pero hindi masyadong significant yung number ng histamine that is being produced. So ako lang gi-highlight is yung mga major histamine-producing cells. Okay? So we are done with the location or yung distribution ng insulin in the body. Now let us proceed to the biosynthesis and metabolism of histamine. Okay? So in the synthesis of histamine, take note, in the synthesis of histamine, it only involves a single step. So itong part na to, that involves the synthesis of histamine. Okay? And then itong part na to mula sa structure to the right, okay, that involves metabolism. Okay? So this involves synthesis of histamine. Ito naman yung metabolism of histamine. Okay, so let's have first the synthesis of histamine. So single step lang ang involved. It requires an amino acid precursor. Okay, yung raw material na kailangan para mag-synthesize ng histamine is ang amino acid, which is the L-histidine. Okay, the amino acid L-histidine. So this amino acid will be converted to histamine via decarboxylation reaction. Okay? Again, histidine is being converted to histamine via decarboxylation reaction, particularly in the presence of the enzyme L-histidine decarboxylase. Okay? So yan yung enzyme na kailangan para mag-undergo og decarboxylation reaction yung histidine, producing histamine. So this is the structure of histamine. Diba? So as the name suggests, diba, hist, amine, histamine. So sa structure, meron kang makikitang histidine ring. So kanang heterocyclic ring nga imuhang gakakita sa slide, yan yung histidine ring. Then yung amine part is in a form of ethyl amine. Diba? Ethyl, a two-carbon chain, then you have a primary amine. Now, so that is all about synthesis of histidine. So single step na, no? Histidine, it is being catalyzed by the enzyme L-histidine decarboxylase, then mabuo na si histamine. Now for degradation, let's proceed to the degradation. Okay, degradation or metabolism of histamine. Take note, it occurs in two pathways. Okay, it occurs in two pathways. We have the oxidation, yung nasa baba, oxidation of histamine, then yung nasa taas yung kulay blue na pathway, that involves methylation. Okay, methylation process, methylation of histamine. Okay? Now for oxidation, yung nasa baba muna. Okay? Yung oxidation of histamine, that is being carried out by the enzyme diamine oxidase. Okay, diamine oxidase, producing the metabolite imidazole acetic acid. Whereas methylation naman of histamine, that is being catalyzed by the enzyme N-methyl transferase. Okay, producing the intermediate product N-methyl histamine. Okay, so methylation man, so you add a methyl group in the structure of histamine via the enzyme N-methyl transferase. That already render the structure of histamine inactive. Okay? Now, this metabolite, kaning N-methyl histamine, okay, yung N-methyl histamine, that can be a further substrate of diamine oxidase. Isa ra di ka M. Okay, isa ra ka M. Ayan. So again, itong metabolite na N-methyl histamine, it can be a further substrate of diamine oxidase. So same enzyme na ginamit for oxidation pathway. Okay, ng histamine kanina. Okay, so N-methyl, pwede din siya maging substrate ng diamine oxidase, producing the final metabolite, which is a methyl derivative of imidazole acetic acid. Okay, so yung takeaway nyo dito, both degradation pathway, yung number 1, yung number 2 pathway, ang major metabolite is isang imidazole acetic acid. Only that, on the first pathway, dito sa first pathway, it is a methyl derivative of imidazole acetic acid, yung nabuo. Because yung metabolism via oxidation is done on a methylated histamine. Hindi katulad dito sa second nga pathway. Ang oxidation via the enzyme diamine oxidase nangyari sa mismong histamine. Kaya yung product is imidazole acetic acid. Whereas kanina, yung oxidation nangyari sa methylated, no? Yung sa second pathway, yung oxidation directly occurs in the methylated histamine. Kaya, yung final product sa first pathway is a methyl derivative of imidazole acetic acid. Okay? So, overall, this is all about the synthesis and metabolism of histamine. Okay? So, we are done with the biosynthesis and metabolism of histamine. Okay, so at this juncture, let us proceed now to histaminergic receptors. Okay? So, mga histamine receptors naman. So, mo ni siya ang medyo dirigin mo mag-build og foundation in order for you to understand the clinical applications of the drugs later on. Same pattern lang how you learn the theories on adrenergic drugs, 'di ba? We started with uh, the receptors, the adrenergic receptors. You master the effects and the responses of the receptors on a specific organ. Okay? Para pag ma-master na ninyo ang mga effects sa receptors on a specific organ, that will be easier for you na kapag naanay mga drugs. Okay? Sige. For a while. Okay. Sige. Now there are actually 4 different histamine receptors. Okay, natay 4 different histamine receptors. Okay, and these are designated as histamine 1. Ako lang siya i-highlight ha. We have histamine 1, histamine 2, histamine 3, and histamine 4 receptors. Okay, so again, these are the different subtypes of histamine receptors, 1 to 4. So since ang focus of the drugs that will be discussed under this topic are those drugs that affects only histamine 1 and histamine 2, mas magbe-build kayo ng foundation on histamine 1 and 2 receptor. So you have to master, you have to learn saan located ang histamine 1, saan located ang histamine 2, and you also need to master what are the effects or what are the responses of these receptors based on their specific locations, okay, or specific organs. Kaya kung kabalo ka sa normal responses kapag na-stimulate yung histamine 1 to that specific site, you will know later on kung unsa ang effect ng isang agonist drug, antagonist drug later on to that histamine receptor. So again, in general, we have 4 receptor subtypes, and take note, all the 4 receptor types, they belong to the large superfamily of G protein coupled receptors. Okay, again, all 4 types are coupled with G protein. So meaning they are actually GPCR. Okay, G protein coupled receptors. So itong figure na to on this slide, it shows the different locations of each types of histamine receptors. Again, on this slide, you can see here the different locations of each type of histamine receptor. Okay? So, itong mga nakikita nyong organs, mga glands, mga cells, tissues, these are the specific locations of these particular histamine receptors. Okay? So, para klaro sa tanan ha, yung i-discuss ko in this slide is ano yung specific effect or responses ng mga organs na to or tissues na to or glands na to kapag nag-bind yung histamine to that specific receptor located on that site. Okay? So, dapat ang inyong i-master ani nga slide is asa siya located, then unsa ang specific responses or effect kapag na-stimulate yung mismong type of receptor, okay, found in them. So, let's start with histamine 1. Sorry. Okay. So, histamine 1, take note, histamine 1 is a GQ-linked receptor. Okay, so this is GQ linked. Okay, so no problem with the secondary messengers or what specific secondary messenger are being released or involved kapag GQ, GSGI ang isang receptor. Okay, kasi you know that already, di ba, sa prior discussion nato, kapag GQ linked, GI linked, GS linked, you know already what secondary messengers are being released. Okay, now the following are the locations of histamine 1 receptor. So number 1, take note, I'll start with the extravascular smooth muscle of bronchioles. Kanang represented in the figure is actually an alveoli. Okay, familiar man tag alveoli, no? Alveoli, wala na siya lain nga ginalocatean sa ato ang body, sa lungs ra gyud na siya. Okay, so sa lungs. So again, one of the location of histamine 1 receptor is sa extravascular, susulat ko ha, extravascular smooth muscles of bronchioles. So example ng extravascular smooth muscle that is being represented in the figure is alveoli. Okay? So take note, activation or stimulation of histamine 1 receptor in the extravascular smooth muscle of bronchi causes bronchoconstriction. Okay? So, diri na ko siya. Diri na lang na ako ibutang ha. Take note, bronchoconstriction. Okay? Yung response, okay, ng extravascular smooth muscle of bronchi kapag na-activate yung histamine 1 receptor na andon. Okay? Now, this response commonly occurs during anaphylaxis. Okay? So, nadumduman to ganina ang release ng histamine from a mast cell. Di ba, ang akong gihatag ng example is due to allergic reaction. Okay? Now, as mentioned earlier, okay, yung excessive histamine release, kapag sobrang taas yung na-release na histamine from a mast cell, diba, that leads to allergic reaction. And there are different signs and symptoms that is being experienced by a person during anaphylaxis. Diba, one of the most commonly experienced by a person during anaphylaxis is breathing difficulty. Bakit may breathing difficulty? Because of bronchoconstriction. Okay? Because of bronchoconstriction. So, breathing difficulty. Okay? So, again ha, this is mainly because more histamine binds to histamine 1 receptor, and binding of histamine to histamine 1 receptor activates the H1 receptor in the extravascular smooth muscles of the bronchial, leading to contraction, nagko-contract yung respiratory airways. Di ba, yung respiratory airway ng bronchial is yung alveoli. So kung contracted na siya, constricted yung bronchioles, there would be difficulty in breathing. Okay, so that is why mostly kapag may allergic reaction during anaphylaxis, a person experiences breathing difficulty. Okay. Next, histamine 1 receptor are also found in, number 2, it is also found in the endothelial cell. So, kani direta. Okay, number 2, it is also found, okay, so pakisulat, endothelial cells. Okay, yung endothelial cells, those are very important for the lining of the blood vessels. No, that is why in the illustration, sige ako siyang ayan. Sa illustration, gi-emphasize ang lining, yung lining of the blood vessels. So that's for endothelial cells. Those are very important, no? Ang endothelial cells, very important na siya because they serves as a lining to regulate exchanges between bloodstream and the surrounding tissues. Okay, so regulation sa mga exchanges ng fluids and other nutrients between a bloodstream and the outside nga tissues. Okay, so example ng endothelial cell which composes the lining of the blood vessel, example is yung capillary. Okay, again, capillary, this is an endothelial cell. In fact, it is 100% endothelial cell. It is made up of only endothelial cells, ang capillaries. Okay, capillaries. Now, normally, ang endothelial cells as being illustrated, kung inyong lantawon sa illustration, no? Kanang lining. Di ba, ang inyong makita is endothelial cells that are evenly lines up in the blood vessel wall. Ang akong ipasabot is kaning ingani siya pagka-drawn. Normally, mo ni siya ang normal nga endothelial cells. Okay, so something ano siya, they evenly line up. Example, mo ni siyang wall. Okay, sa blood vessels, they evenly line up. Okay. So, yan na. So, mula na siya ang nasa illustration. Kung inyohang tutukan ang sa iyahang wall ng blood vessel, so you have endothelial cells that are evenly lines up in the blood vessel wall. Now, kapag na-activate, okay, na-activate yung histamine 1 receptor or na-stimulate ang histamine 1 receptor in the endothelial cells, that causes contraction of endothelial cells. Take note. That leads to contraction of endothelial cells. So imagine from this normal lining of blood vessel, di ba, evenly silang nag-line up sa blood vessel walls. Kung nag-contract ang endothelial cells, which makes up the lining of the blood vessel, that will cause separation of the endothelial cells. Okay? Magsiseparate ngayon yung endothelial cells. Now, that separation of endothelial cell will form temporary gaps. Diba? Naakaroy gaps. Okay, temporary gaps. That will eventually result to vascular leakage. Magli-leak. Kung unsay mga fluids, interstitial fluid na andon sa inside ng blood vessel, sa bloodstream, magli-leak siya. Which is supposedly dili dapat. Mantugay na atay lining endothelial cells para regulated yung exchanges between bloodstream and the surrounding tissues. So again, this contraction of the endothelial cells, that results to vascular leakage. Yung mga interstitial fluid will move out from the blood, or yung process na yan is called transudation. Okay? Yung mga interstitial fluid lalabas. Okay, lalabas, it will move out from the blood and mag-accumulate yung fluid sa mga local tissues. Okay? And that will lead to local edema. Okay? 'Di ba kung naay tubig na magtipok on a certain tissue, mag-swell na siya. In medical term, edema na siya, edema. So local edema na localized swelling. Kasi nga again, due to vascular leakage, may mga fluids from the blood na napupunta outside the bloodstream, na-accumulate siya sa mga local tissues causing local edema. Okay? Again, in general, this is because of increased capillary permeability. Okay? Increased capillary permeability. Increase na iyahang permeability towards exchanges ng fluids outside and inside the bloodstream. Kasi nga, meron ng mga temporary gaps. Diba? Upon contraction, nag-contract ang endothelial cells na anay mga temporary gaps in between, transudation will happen. Meaning permeable na yung capillary ngayon. Okay? So enhancement, increase of capillary permeability that will lead ultimately to local edema. Okay, so that's the second location of histamine 1 receptor. Okay, we have endothelial cells, effect, contraction of endothelial cells. Ultimate response later on is local edema due to increased capillary permeability. Next, another location of histamine 1 receptor is vascular smooth muscles. Okay? Wala siya Diri na ako siya isulat ha. Number 3 is vascular smooth muscles. This is still under histamine 1 ha, location of histamine 1 receptor. So vascular smooth muscle, particularly in the blood vessels, and stimulation of histamine 1 receptor in the blood vessel that leads to vasodilation. So, tandaan nyo ha yung mga responses, okay, or effect kapag na-stimulate yung specific histamine receptor on this sites or in this location. Sa blood vessel, meron ding histamine 1 kapag na-activate yun. Okay, nag-bind ang histamine sa histamine 1 receptor, vasodilation will happen. Okay? Now, itong vasodilation effect, okay, yung binding ng histamine to histamine receptor in the blood vessel, that actually releases nitric oxide. Okay, nitric oxide from the endothelial cell and prostaglandin I from other cells. Okay? Again, kapag nag-bind yung histamine sa histamine 1 receptor present in the blood vessels, yung nangyayari, bakit merong vasodilation, it is because may release of nitric oxide and prostaglandin I. Okay? PGI. These two endogenous compounds are actually endogenous vasodilators. Kapag na-release ito sila, vasodilation yung effect. That is why yung net effect is vasodilation. Okay? So, diretso nga, because na ay histamine 1 receptor in the blood vessel, agad-agad may vasodilation effect. Yung vasodilation effect is actually associated because of the release of nitric oxide and prostaglandin, okay, which are endogenous vasodilators. Okay, kaya yung end effect is vasodilation. Okay? And if you try to recall, di ba pag may vasodilation, pag may, kapag ang effect is vasodilation, yung ultimate manifestation niya or yung ultimate effect niya towards BP is hypotension. Di ba? Kapag may vasodilation, that leads to hypotension. Okay? Pag excessive na, sobrang uh, um, prolonged na yung dilation ng blood vessels, that would lead to lowering of the blood pressure. Okay, kaya may hypotension. Okay, but good thing about our body is part sa ato ang compensatory mechanism ng body natin, kapag na-detect ng utak na may pagbaba ng blood pressure, okay, it will ultimately send stimulus that could somehow increase back the blood pressure. Yan yung good thing about our body. Meron tayong mga compensatory mechanism. Diba? Daghan biya ta klase compensatory mechanism. Example, nasayop ka og tulon, imbis na sa esophagus nimo siya natulong, dito siya napadulong sa kanang agianan bitaw towards the lungs. Diba? Ang atong compensatory mechanism or defense mechanism is coughing. Okay? Even fever, colds, those are actually defense mechanisms of our body. So when it comes to BP blood pressure, kapag too much hypotension, too much hypertension, ang atong body naa siya somehow compensatory mechanism. Okay, so bright ang ato ang utok. Okay, they will try to send, example, ang stimulus is mababa yung pressure, blood pressure, it will send a stimulus that could somehow increase the BP. That mechanism is actually controlled by a baroreceptor reflex. You can actually search it sa mga other references sa pharmacology, or you can just read or watch videos on baroreceptor reflex. That is very interesting, no? Yung baroreceptor reflex ng body natin, this is actually a negative feedback mechanism ng body natin to compensate, to maintain balance in our body. Okay, so kahit it leads to hypotension, okay, dahil sa, di ba, may hypotension dahil sa vasodilation effect, okay, upon stimulation ng H1 receptor, later on, that effect na vasodilation, that is usually accompanied by a reflex tachycardia. Okay, later on, due to baroreceptor reflex, magkakaroon ng accompanied reflex tachycardia. This is a later effect. Okay? Kaya basin matingala mo kung mag-read mo og other references when it comes to stimulation of H1 receptor in the blood vessels, ang makabutang mangyud usually is vasodilation and vasoconstriction. Okay, maglibog mo which of which di ay, ma'am? Vasodilation or vasoconstriction? Due to vasodilation, di ba, na ay hypotension. Now, our body meron tayong compensatory mechanism. Okay? So, natay negative feedback mechanism. So, to balance, to compensate that decrease in BP, magsisend siya ng stimulus to increase back the blood pressure. Kaya, later on, may reflex tachycardia, and this is somehow associated with vasoconstriction. That is the reason bakit, for some other references, kapag na-enhance ang histamine 1 receptor sa blood vessel, vasodilation and vasoconstriction yung effect. Okay? That is also the reason bakit may heart dito sa figure. Diba? Na ay heart. So, mo ni siya ang sa reflex tachycardia nga part, na ay frequent heartbeat later on na ma-feel due to, again, reflex tachycardia. So, you can have this number 4. Okay, sa heart. Okay. Unaccompanied or kaakibat nga response. Okay. Accompanied or kaakibat na response by or caused by vasodilation is frequent heartbeat sa heart. Yan na, heartbeat. So, di na ta mag-heart. Okay? So, heart beats, frequent heart beats. So, yan yung effect. Okay? And we also have, ayan, we also have here, wala gihapon siya na sulat, no? Number 4, naman na to ni siya ibutang. Number 5 na pala. Number 5, dari na lang. Okay. Kamo na mag-arrange siya. Number 5, sa sensory nerve endings. So, medyo daghan ni siya, no? Histamine 1 receptor are also located in the sensory nerve endings. Sensory nerve endings. And take note, stimulation of histamine 1 receptor sa sensory nerve endings, that causes pain and itchiness. Okay? So somehow allergic reaction related gihapon ni siya. Isa sa mga signs and symptoms kapag may anaphylaxis. Okay, di ba? Pain, itchiness. Okay, so that is also part of stimulation of histamine 1 receptor. Okay, sensory nerve endings, pain and itchiness. And lastly, we have histamine 1 receptor in the brain. So kaniyang number 6. In the brain or in the CNS. Okay, so tandaan, histamine in the CNS, recall that it occurs as neurotransmitters. Okay, and activation of histamine 1 receptor in the CNS, that leads to stimulation of the brain. Ano lang, kapag na-stimulate yung histamine 1 receptor sa CNS, ang effect is stimulation of the brain. So kung stimulated, 'di ba, ang CNS, nakay feeling of wakefulness. Okay, feeling of wakefulness. Okay? Alive ka. Okay? Wakefulness. Again, kapag may activation of histamine 1 receptor in the CNS, in the brain, that will ultimately lead to stimulation of the brain, feeling of wakefulness. Okay. Now, question. Try na to kung nasabtan. If ang drug with antagonizing effect to histamine 1 receptor on the CNS is being taken by a patient, okay, what do you think will happen or what will be the effect sa patient if na-block yung histamine 1 receptor in the brain? Is it wakefulness or drowsiness? Okay, very good. No, so naa kay feeling of drowsiness, drowsy ka, or naay sedating effect. Kaya nga, di ba, pansin nyo, kung nag-take ka og antihistamine, the antihistamine, these are histamine blockers. Kapag nag-take ka ng histamine, ano yung usual side effect? Katulgon ka, drowsiness. Di ba? That is because ginablock niya ang effect ng histamine receptor in the brain. Okay? That's why sedating ang effect. Sedation or drowsiness. Pero there are antihistamines, di ba, na non-drowse. Okay? So, yun na. Okay? Sige, so that is all about, okay, histamine 1 receptor. Okay? So overall, we're done with the different locations with histamine 1 receptors and its effects upon stimulation. Okay? Now, before ta mag-proceed to histamine 2 receptor, in relation gihapon siya sa histamine 1 stimulation, histamine 1 receptor stimulation, we have this response called, other nang ko magsulat ha. We have this response called triple response or for some other references, triple response of Lewis. Okay? Usually, this is termed as triple response lang or triple response of Lewis. So, unsa ni siya? Ang triple response, this is commonly seen, this is commonly observed or produced upon intradermal injection of histamine. Okay, so kung gi-inject ang histamine, okay, via intradermal, so in between the skin part, okay, naa kay usual or common yun nga triple response nga always manifested to that part of the skin kung asa ang intradermal injected site. Okay? So what are this triple response? This includes number one, red dot. Okay? Red dot or medical term ani is flush. Ibig sabihin na localized red spot. Okay? Sa mismong uh, site kung asa gi-inject ang histamine intradermally. Okay? So that's one. Another is localized swelling. Okay, localized swelling or yung medical term, di ba pag swelling, medical term is edema. Okay? Or this is also termed, sa anatomy, this is termed as wheal. Okay? This is also another medical term kapag localized swelling. Okay? And three, there is spreading erythema. Okay? Or medical term ani is flare. Okay? So ito yung abnormal redness of the skin, di ba? Erythema, abnormal redness of the skin due to capillary congestion. Again, spreading erythema or flare, this is simply abnormal redness of the skin due to capillary congestion. So ito yung mga triple responses kapag ang histamine is injected intradermally. Okay? So common ni siya. And kani gyud siya usually gyud ang makita. Walang labis, walang kulang, nagyud ni sila triple response of Lewis or simply triple response. Okay? So recap ta before ta mag continue sa histamine 2 receptor. We have the following locations of histamine 1 receptor. We have the extravascular smooth muscles of bronchioles. Effect is bronchoconstriction. Next, endothelial cells. Effect, contraction of endothelial cells leading to local edema. Third, sa blood vessels. Vasodilation, and this is accompanied later on by vasoconstriction, usually manifested by reflex tachycardia. Kaya sa heart, there is frequent heartbeats. Next, sensory nerve endings. There is pain and itchiness. And lastly, in the brain, there is stimulation or wakefulness. Kapag may antihistamines na tinake, particularly isang histamine 1 blocker, usually yung side effect, di ba, is sedation. Okay? Sige, let's proceed this time to histamine 2 receptor. So don't worry, ang inyo lang yung mas i-familiarize is histamine 1 and histamine 2. Kasi yung madadiscuss na mga drugs are those drugs that only target histamine 1 and 2. Yun yung kasi yung mga available in the market. Okay? Histamine 1 and histamine 2 blockers. Okay? Now, for histamine 2 receptor, this is actually GQ ang H1 receptor, ang histamine 2 naman is GS. Okay, GS linked. Okay, and there are different or numerous sites where histamine 2 receptors are located. Okay, however, among these sites nga gi-represent in this figure, tandaan nyo nga ang histamine 1 receptor, they are most dominant. They are commonly found in the parietal cells. Okay? Ayan. Again, parietal cells. Okay? So, asa man ang parietal cells? In the stomach. Okay? Parietal cells in the stomach. So, take note, very dominant yun ang histamine 2 receptor sa parietal cells of the stomach. And unsa di ang function sa parietal cells in the stomach? Take note, parietal cells in the stomach, it secretes HCl and intrinsic factor. Okay? Again, parietal cells in the stomach, it secretes HCl and the intrinsic factor, which is very needed for vitamin B12 absorption. Okay? Absorption. B12. Yung cyanocobalamin. Okay? So again, function lang to ha. Function ng parietal cells. Wala pa tong kapag na-activate yung histamine 2 in the parietal cells. This is a normal function ng parietal cell. It secretes HCl. It also secretes intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor that is needed for vitamin B12 absorption. Now, kapag nag-bind ang histamine to histamine 2 receptor, which is located in the parietal cells, that leads to enhanced basal gastric acid secretion. Okay? That leads to basal gastric acid secretion. Okay, so take note, kapag na-activate yung histamine 2 receptor sa parietal cell, there is gastric acid secretion. Therefore, unsa iyahang net effect sa HCl, taas yung HCl level in the stomach. Okay? No, additional information lang to, dili na ako siya i-write ha. Additional information lang siya to give you an idea. Okay, to give you an idea. Normally, ang gastric acid secretion, generally, it peaks at night. Okay? In general, ang gastric acid secretion yun, it peaks at night. Okay? So at night, ang stomach acid, okay? Ang stomach acid secretes at its highest peak compare at daytime. This is the main reason why it is not advisable to eat a lot at night. Nasabtan ninyo, nga no? Kasi nga, ang stomach acid, di ba, yung peak time nga mag-secrete, manggawas, okay, peak time nga taas ang level ng gastric acid secretion is at night. Kung mukaon kag daghan sa gabi, musamot ang imuhang tiyan mag-release og acid. Kay di ba kailangan, kung magkaon ka, normally mag-secrete gyud ang ato ang stomach og acid para i-digest ang food. Okay? Na taas na gani ang level sa acid because that is the peak time ng secretion ng stomach acid. Nagkaon pa gyud ka, samot mag-release og stomach acid. That's why pagkabuntag, gutom kayo inyong pamati. 'Di ba? Kasi nga sobrang taas ng stomach acid pagka morning. If you really eat a lot sa midnight, that is between mga 11 to 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. So nga na mo na siya ang peak time nga mag-secrete ang gastric acid. Okay, so that is just an additional information for you to have an idea. Okay, next, yung histamine 2 receptor is also present in the mast cells and basophils. Okay, so ito yung mast cells. Okay, mast cells I-end na lang na ako ha. End. Ito yung basophils. So, iisa na lang siya. Mast cells and basophils. Histamine 2 receptor nga stimulation or activation that will lead to release of histamine from mast cells and basophils. Okay? Particularly, there will be degranulation. Okay? That will happen. Di ba pag sinabing nga prefix there is removal. So there would be release of histamine from the granules inside the mast cells. So yan yung effect kapag na-activate, di ba, yung mast cells. So histamine 2 ulit, histamine 2 receptor activation that will lead to degranulation resulting to increase histamine release. Okay? So, hindi rin na lang na ako siya isulat. Increase histamine release. Okay? Increase histamine release. Okay? And finally, yung mga di masyadong significantly observed nga responses for histamine 2 receptor stimulation, we have ito vasodilation. So, sa blood vessels, dilated ba ang blood vessels? Vasodilation. Then, we also have, di ba na CNS stimulation din. But this is not significantly observed yun ha, sa histamine 2 activation. Okay? Then, na heart, so ganun pa rin, frequent heartbeats. Okay? But again, i-repeat na ako, ang stimulation ng histamine 2 receptor, most significant, most dominant yung response observed sa parietal cells. Okay? Mo gina ang pinaka-dominant location ng histamine 2 receptor sa parietal cells. So, ang net effect ulit, gastric acid secretion. So, question, before ta mag-end, 11:30 na. If you encounter a drug classified as H2 blocker, what do you think will happen to stomach acid HCl? Taas or baba? Okay, very good. Okay, bababa. Okay, gi-block ang histamine 2 receptor sa parietal cell, pigil ngayon yung gastric acid secretion, bababa yung HCl level. So, we will continue the discussion, wala gayud ta na humano sa histamine, which is dapat akong goal. So, taas pagid kaayo siya. Okay, but sige lang, ako yung goal is mahuman nato ang Autacoids for this week. Kay this is part of your semifinals examination. Okay, so you have any question? Walay question? Walay question? Hoy, paningog pud mo, naamang na mo. Sige. So, wala na yung question. Sige, thank you so much. Nag-exceed ta og 1 minute. So, thank you so much for joining. Complete attendance mo in fairness. Okay, so, thank you everyone for joining and for listening. Kabalo ko boring gid kaayo, pero thank you gid kaayo kay complete attendance. Ang uban siguro natulog na, pero it's okay. Okay, so I will post the recorded lecture video later or tonight na siguro. Okay, so God bless everyone and see you again next meeting. Sige, bye.
Bye, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Oo, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.